Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the final day of the WSDS 2020. Yesterday will be a tough act to follow, hey? A lot of really blistering speeches, some great discussions, and I felt a sort of yo-yo effect, personally, that sometimes, depending who was speaking, or maybe even depending what point they got to in their speech, I either sort of felt really quite optimistic that we can crack this, or really quite pessimistic about the scale of the challenge. And I think in the end I emerged sort of just about on the optimistic side, just about glass half full, not because I minimize the extent of the challenges facing us, but more because we heard about the whole array of actions, of solutions that are to hand if we can just seize them. And I suspect we're going to get more of that in the first session. I think we'll probably emerge just about glass half full, but there's a masterly report that's been produced by the McKinsey Global Institute on climate risk and response. And I'd like to introduce, to take us through this, Mr. Rajat Gupta, Senior Partner and Leader at McKinsey & Company, and to introduce him, Dr. Mathur, Director General of TERI. Gentlemen, please.
Welcome yet again to TERI. It's absolutely, we are delighted to have you. And especially when this, and I use the word that Martin used, when this masterly report is being presented. We have discussed the kinds of adverse impacts that climate would have on our lives, whether it is in the form of heat, or whether it is in the form of floods, or whether it is in the form of cyclones and so on. But what has been missing is a quantitative assessment of these impacts. And it is actually good but also sad to see that this requires an understanding of how deadly these vulnerabilities and impacts could be. But given the kind of thought leadership, given the kinds of new methodological approaches that McKinsey is famous for, the McKinsey Global Institute has put together a set of, let me say, tools, working tools on how to move ahead. So without further ado, let me turn over to Rajat to talk about the report itself, the kinds of findings, and then I would ask him, if it is okay with you, Rajat, a couple of key issues that have kind of bothered me, troubled me as I read the report. So it's all yours.
Thank you. Okay, let me just get going. So, McKinsey, and to some extent the McKinsey Global Institute, has focused on the topic of environmental sustainability quite a bit. I myself had written about it 10 years ago. We developed the GHG abatement cost curve for India around the framework of where we developed globally, a global curve which then went into geographies. And that was a lot around abatement. More recently, which is over the last 6 to 9 months, the McKinsey Global Institute has been working on figuring out what are the real risks that come alive as a result of climate change and particularly GHG emissions. And we've looked at these risks from a 10-year perspective and a 30-year perspective. Can we have the projection up there? Yeah, thank you. So we've looked at it from a 10-year perspective, 2030, and that's a bit of a given because nothing that we do today is going to make a difference on what emission state we are on by 2030. Of course, we can take adaptation actions, in that time frame, but at least from a climate risk perspective, whatever is out there, and the impact that can have, at least the dimensions of that impact can be measured, and which is what we've tried to do. And the other time horizon that we've taken is 2050. First and foremost, modern society, what we live in, has been built and constructed with the assumption of a stable climate, because the climate over the last 10,000 years has broadly been stable. Probably after the last ice age, it's been a stable climate. And so, for example, if you take the choice of crops that are grown in a particular geography, the design standards that a subway is put to, the expectation of flooding that you expect for infrastructure, other infrastructure that you build, the level at which you build houses. This is a bit of a given based on the past and the history. And obviously our economic, social, financial activity, buying, selling, investing, borrowing, lending, is very much based on the history, right? Now, this chart here shows that line on the right, top right. Basically, history is no longer going to be a predictor of the future, right? And which is probably what you've been discussing over the course of the last 2 days. And, this has already happened. This is temperature shifts. While we talk about 1.5 degrees, there's places in the world, the top of the world, which is at 5 degrees already, or 4 or 5 degrees already. And then there are some parts of the world which are also cooling at the bottom, the blues that you see out there. So that change is a bit of a given. Now, in that context, how did we look at the problem, the McKinsey Global Institute? Basically, what we did is we took 9 physical effects of climate change, and the ones that you see here. I'll come back to some of them. I'm not going to go through the details now, I'm to just keep it to time. By the way, the report is available on the McKinsey Global Institute website, and there's probably a 2-page flyer here, which also has a link on where to go to, so you can go and get some sense of the detail. I'm just going to give you a bit of an overview. So we studied 9 impacts of climate change. Does it get too hot to work? What's the Mediterranean when it's hot with no tourism and the climate isn't cool anymore? What does flooding do in Vietnam? And so on, and so on, right? So we studied 9 geographically specific phenomena, and by the way, we picked from 40, right, and arrived at these 9. These 9 were also ones that were most likely to flip over in a 5-year, 10-year time frame, because as you know, climate impact is not linear. After a point, it gets non-linear. For example, heat's effect on human body, and so on. So we picked these 9. And deep dived into these. We did a detailed case study, for example, on India, and what would temperature rise and humidity rise, that's consequent to it, do to India and Pakistan, actually the Indian subcontinent, right? And I also have to caveat this, McKinsey does have climate scientists, but we are not climate scientists. So we took climate science as a given. We worked with Woods Hole Research Center on a lot of the climate science, and we put the layer of economics of physical harm, the magnitude of that harm, and the economic magnitude of that harm on top of that. That's what we layered on. And then what we did is we took 105 countries and we made an assessment of what kind of these 9 different types of phenomenon, physical harm phenomenon, and extrapolated this effectively for the world, 80-90% of the world's GDP, roughly 80-90% of the world's geography, and so on. And from that bottom-up picture of the 9 cases, built up what could be the impact for the world. So that's the approach to the study. Let me jump to results. So what is really at risk? And again, we divided this into 5 types of risks, or 5 types of systems that get risked. And by the way, the numbers and the examples you see here are that these systems are already being impacted, and we know this from what we read in the press. So the first one was livability and workability, and I'll come back to this and talk about the heat example in India specifically, or the Indian subcontinent. The food systems, the availability of food, particularly around grain. Again, I'll come back and describe this. Physical assets. Infrastructure services, this is like availability of grids, this is availability of subways, availability of roads, transportation systems, and so on. And then finally, natural capital, right? So glaciers is the example written here, but it's also tropical forests and the impact on the biome. So we looked at all of these, and then, the impact, and looked at the impact on each of these. I think we've managed to get this stuck. Can we go to the next page if somebody else is control? Oh, there you are. Good. Let's come. It's all right. This is not, let me just check if it's working. Okay. So let me take the first one of this around livability and, is it there? Clicker? No, it's not here. Okay, it's fine. Don't worry. Sorry? Yeah, no problem. So first one is livability and workability. So what you see here on the picture here is today's, on the top is the effective share of working hours lost today. And as you move to 2030 and 2050 as assessed by the estimates that were made, and the impact on the right. And similarly, probability of annual lethal heat waves. And lethal defined as the temperature being more than 42 degrees, or actually more than 35 degrees wet bulb over a 3 or 4 day period. So it's been defined scientifically. So that's the definition of it. So, what of this is that, the societies and systems that are the most at risk are the ones that are close to physical and biological threshold. And as you can see on the left here, and on the left two graphs, on both of these fronts, whether it's loss of work hours or lethal heat waves, you can say that parts of the subcontinent, or large parts in one case of the subcontinent, are already close to those thresholds. And by the way, I should also caveat this and say that we took the RCP 8.5, the 4.3 degree scenario by 2100. And the conclusions were that about 180 million people, plus minus, would live in regions with a 5% average annual probability of experiencing heat waves that exceed the survivability thresholds of a healthy human being. So 1 in 20 chance, so in 20 years once, that 180 million people would be exposed to heat waves. This is also assuming some degree of increasing air conditioner penetration, but also assuming how many people are working outdoors, which in a country like India is a lot, right? So as a result, what would happen? Of course, there would be risk to life, but in addition, outdoor labor productivity would be impacted, right? So reducing the number of effective hours worked outdoors. So just as a benchmark, as of 2017, heat-exposed work produces about half of our GDP. The construction GDP, our agricultural GDP, large parts of our GDP is actually produced by heat-exposed work. It is 30% of our growth. Thank you. It is 30% of our growth, right? So our growth is obviously moving towards services and industrialization, but still 30% of the growth is still heat-exposed work. It employs 75% of our workforce, which is about 380 million people. So these are people who are in heat-exposed situations. And as a result of all of this and the extra heating that we get, about the average number of lost working hours could be as much as 2.5 to 4. So let's say on average 3.5% of GDP annually. This is the impact of physical change. Let me take the next one, which is on food systems. So just a few facts around this. 60% of global grain production happens in 5 countries, or you can say 6 continents, maybe even more than that: China, US, India, Brazil, Argentina, and if you count the EU. It is very concentrated. Even within these, it's very concentrated. So we know roughly 90% of wheat production in India is from 5 states. Now, the entire food system has been geared for efficiency. So it's moved towards places where the production is the most efficient, and it's a tight system where food is moving around in a reasonably efficient manner, certainly within geographies, and a bit across geographies also, across regions also. And the impact of climate change is obviously there because of continuous shifts, environmental shifts that are happening, higher increasing temperatures, but also more frequent impact of more episodes of acute stress, like drought, like heat waves, excessive rainfall. And this system, which is optimized for efficiency and not for resilience, will obviously get impacted very significantly. Again, this is something that we've studied. There's some numbers that you'll see in the report, which I'm not covering. The one that you see there on the top right is the annual risk of 15% yield failure would actually double by 2030 and quadruple by 2050, right? So it's 1% today, 1 in a 100-year event, will become a 1 in a 25-year event.
Wow.
I won't cover this in detail, but the biome has already shifted 25%, and by 2050, a 45% shift would happen. So I've covered 3 of the 5 areas of action and changes that you see and the economic impact of that. Maybe one other factoid, which is that poorer countries like India, would be more impacted because they are often closer to the physical threshold. They rely more on outdoor work. They have less financial means, our country itself also, to adapt quickly. It will also benefit, climate change will also benefit some countries, Canada, Russia being examples, which will open up more land for example, agricultural production. And, for example, the risk that we talked about in the last page, or last couple of pages around here, heat and humidity. So when looking at the workability indicator, which is the annual share of outdoor working hours lost due to heat and humidity that I talked about earlier, the top quartile of countries based on GDP will have an average risk of 1 to 3%. Right? These are also the countries in the colder climes, as you can see. While the bottom quartile countries, from a GDP perspective, their increased risk will be 5 to 10%, 1 in 10 to 20 year events. Right? So obviously, countries like ours are sort of more impacted, Bangladesh, Pakistan, with lower GDP levels, with just this one. And that, by the way, applies to many other physical phenomena. So in summary, there are 7 characteristics, in a sense, of what we've discovered as a part of this work. So the risk is increasing, somewhere between 2 and 20x, depending on which risk, whether you're talking about flooding, heat waves, et cetera, et cetera. And by the way, we have not been able to study some risks, like, for example, wildfires is not something there's enough research around so that we could use to study this. So this is only those that could be studied, the risks that could be studied, the physical risk. It is local, spatially it's local, it's got to be studied locally, which is what we've tried to do and bottom-up add it up. I think it's non-stationary, it's becoming worse, and whatever is there till 2030 is more or less locked in. I think to 2050 we can still do things around it. It's non-linear because there are systems which are close to threshold, as we described, and these systems are more at risk because they cross a certain threshold. There are knock-on effects, it's systemic. There are knock-on effects, so if you have a heat wave, you have a reduction in food grain production, you have an increasing food grain price, and the knock-on impacts of that on nutrition and so on, particularly again in poorer countries, and therefore it's regressive. And as a society, we are clearly underprepared for it. So what can we do about it? Again, at a high level, I think 3 things for sure. It will have to be factored into all decision-making by the government, by society, by management, by individuals. New models will need to be built, and they have to be built into decisioning by insurers, by people who are building projects, including governments and businesses, by lenders, again, by individuals who are building houses and so on. Adaptation efforts will have to increase to build resilience, to reduce exposure, to protect assets, erecting cooling shelters, for example, adjusting working hours for outdoor workers, building food inventories, relocating assets in communities. All of this will have to come to play. Cooling plans. India's embarked on one. We've started building a cooling plan for India last year. And then, of course, there is the question of decarbonization at scale. Maybe I'll end with an anecdote. So I was with a friend. One of the geographies that we've studied is Florida, and particularly the flooding and storm risks in Florida. So we were in a school reunion. We'd all turned 50 last month in December in Florida at a friend's house, which is right on the ocean, right on the water. And going back, as I was working through this report and its findings, one of the questions that popped in my head is, and he said, look, insurance is going up. There's always a fear that when the storms will come, what will happen to this house of mine, which he uses every weekend. He goes in from Tampa and uses it every weekend. And the thought that was on my mind was, should I be asking him to sell? So this will also impact us individually. So let me just stop there. You have access to the report, and happy to chat for a minute or two.
Thanks ever so much.
Thank you.
Rajat, a bit challenging, but also I think the last slide tells us how we could go ahead and address the issues. So if you have to address the issues, you showed that slide about India, but where do you see the largest impacts occurring, the largest vulnerabilities occurring? We have traditionally looked at the impacts on water as being the most severe. So the temperatures impact water, they impact the hydrological cycle. Is that where we need to focus?
I have to say that it's a bit of everything. So yes, and it's geographically specific. So in India, we do have to focus on the heat issue. We probably have to focus on sea level rise and the impact that it has on our coastline and the income earners that are there. Consequent impact on agricultural productivity, where, like we said, 250 odd million people from our working people, half of our working population is employed, and the impact. And by the way, this is now. I'm talking about in the next 10 years, right? So I think it's very much geographic, and obviously the water stress that it will create. Actually, water availability in India will improve probably as a result of the melting
in the short term.
In the shorter term, and so it's very much specific to geographies. And so I think every geography has to almost figure out its own problem, first and foremost, the impact of the problem, and its set of solutions.
One of the things that you just mentioned and you also spoke about when you were making the presentation is the impact on productivity. I must confess that on the one hand, I personally hadn't thought very much about it. But productivity is also a key issue that is you're able to engage decision makers, whether in the private sector or the public sector. Can we think of some kind of a climate adjusted productivity increase? Because everybody is saying that we have the demographic dividend, we will see productivity increases as the economy becomes more organized. Will we also see a downside? So, and therefore the talk of a climate adjusted productivity increase.
So, look, I think there are some forces at play which are also positive for at least adaptation. So, for example, you take the force of digitization and automation. Right? You take the force of, people are coming off our farms, not quickly enough. I mean, 20 million every 3 years or something, but not quickly enough. But, there are some clear forces, the creation of jobs in the services sector, creation of jobs in the industrial sector, which is where a lot more of the adaptation can happen, right? So you can air condition, offices are air conditioned today already, but even industrial sites, it's easier to air condition than a farm worker.
That's right.
The automation means that if you have big machines, you can have air conditioned cabins, right? In those machines, like you have for mining, for example. Construction and automation within construction, prefabricated construction segments, which are then used to build houses and bridges and roads and all of these things. So there are forces at play here, the force of automation, digitization, which can lead to, of course, higher productivity, automatic adaptation, but we have to be able to create then those kinds of jobs in those sectors.
Manage it, yes. So the skills becomes an important
Skills becomes important. Job creation, I mean, the job doesn't happen unless there's demand for those roads, and at the price point at which the automation can indeed be invested in.
Rajat, many, many thanks. I think this has opened up a completely new area for thought, an area for enforcing, not enforcing, but enabling a kind of change that we look at. As you very rightly said, much of what will happen in 2030 is already done. So it is important that we manage the unavoidable. It is also important that we avoid the unmanageable. Thank you very much, Rajat.
Thank you.